I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. Damien Thorn, the Antichrist, is 12 years old and now living under the supervision of his industrialist uncle Richard Thorn, whilst also attending a military academy. The devil child from the first movie is on the cusp of adulthood. This is Damien, Omen II. As I mentioned in last week's review of The Omen, I watched all 3 parts of the Omen trilogy on consecutive Saturday afternoons at the age of 11, so it's probably fair to say I'm more favourable towards the Omen saga in its entirety than a more discriminating viewer might be of its individual elements. Even so, it's clear to me that the first film is by far and away the most accomplished. That said, I disagree with the majority of reviewers who say that Omen II is merely a retread of the first film. I will admit though that it has more of the look and feel of a TV movie than Richard Donner's first more sumptuous, definitely more cinematic movie. It seems to me that in Omen II there are more sound stages and sets being employed here. I might be wrong, it might just be the way that they're shot and lit, but there is so much wood paneling going on in this movie. I'm sorry to point it out to you if you've never noticed it before, but you won't be able to unsee it now. Just a little bit of variety in the set design would have gone a long way. But a lot of Damien Omen II's detractors just argue that this is a retread where anyone who comes close to discovering Damien's true identity is snuffed out by demonic forces. And that's certainly there, for sure. But I think there is a little more going on than that. I get the feeling that after the perhaps unexpected runaway success of The Omen, a sequel was a little rushed into completion, and at the end of this video I want to suggest ways that a little more time spent on the script may have paid dividends. Yes, the deaths are more elaborate and over the top in Omen II. Yes, the characters are definitely more underdeveloped and some seem to be pushed into the fray just so that they can be oft tout sweet. But I don't think it's just a glut of people threatening to expose the Antichrist and then being killed. There are other moves being made on this demonic chessboard. In The Omen, the devil's acolytes had one brief: protect and entrench. Get the young Antichrist bedded down and safe for his future ascension to power. In Omen II, on the eve of his 13th birthday, however, the scene is being set to provide a power base for the young Antichrist. He will eventually become the head of Thorn Industries, but that corporation must already be laying the groundwork for Armageddon. Hell has a grand plan of which Damien is only a part, and those pieces standing in the way of that larger plan must also be removed from the board. It's a subtle difference perhaps, but it's one that happens to be important to me. There is a wider world of satanic machinations going on, a global reach to the devil's maneuverings, which is opened up a little here in Omen II and will be revealed in even uglier detail in the final conflict. Jerry Goldsmith returns to provide the music and proves himself to be the MVP of the franchise. The score echoes some of the motifs of the Oscar-winning score for The Omen, but everything is punched up, sped up, keeping the choral aspect that played like absolute gangbusters in The Omen, but adding unusual electronic elements. And then there's that great effect, I don't know whether it's vocal, electronic, or a mixture of both, that acts as a sort of signifier for the cawing of the satanic crow, a sort of bwap that is weirdly funky and frightening and funny all at the same time. This is a score which is busting loose and having fun. It makes me think that the forces of the devil are on the rise, flexing their muscles at this point on the ascendancy in the career of the Antichrist. Sort of anything goes. In last week's review I talked about the wonderful moments spread all the way through The Omen, and Omen II is not shy of a few high notes itself. The ice skating death, the death under the ice, is horrible and protracted. Certainly a high point of the movie. It's a way of getting the character of Bill Atherton out of the way so that Paul Buer can pilot Thorn Industries into more diabolical waters, laying the groundwork for the future Battle of Armageddon. And the lift death, man, clearly intended to be this movie's version of David Warner getting decapitated. The Doctor getting sliced in half in the lift is even played through in slow motion from multiple angles to act as a visual tie to Jennings' decapitation in the first movie. Is it a bit OTT? Sure, but like I said earlier, the devil's showing off at this point. Did this 11-year-old lap it up? You can bet your horns and pointed tail I did. Then there's Damien schooling his history teacher on important dates. There are no bells and whistles, no effects here, but it's a great scene. Likewise, the scene of Damien confronting his cousin Mark, no effects, just two characters interacting. But I truly believe that Damien loves his cousin, loves him as a brother, as he says. I believe that Damien's offer to share control of the world is genuine, and that Damien is heartbroken at having to kill Mark. And can I just say that without the benefit of any special effects or razzmatazz, Lucas Donat as Mark acts the shit out of dying from a brain aneurysm. So let's talk a little bit about Damien, Jonathan Scott Taylor. Our very first sighting of Damien, quite cheekily, knowingly, is through the rippling flames of a garden bonfire. And over the years, I've really warmed to Scott Taylor's performance and this particular take on the Antichrist. I love the fact that the young Damien is scared of Aunt Marion. Again, just like we talked about last week in the first movie, Damien's a little bit of a pawn here. He's actually really quite likeable for the first portion of the movie. At least, sure, he's a privileged little snot, but what 12-year-old boy isn't? Scott Taylor humanises the son of the devil. He's an orphan who's found his home and is genuinely horrified when he discovers the 3/6 the proof of his true identity. He's come round to the idea by the next scene, unfortunately, because there's a lot more drama to be mined there. And once he's accepted his destiny, the film almost has nowhere to go. You could argue that it sort of loses its way and paddles into much less interesting waters. Another standout moment is the death of the journalist Joan Hart, which perhaps illustrates the good and the bad of Omen II at the same time. Yes, it's overblown, but it's an Omen film. What do you want? And yes, she's undercooked as a character there to briefly serve the same role that Patrick Troughton did in the first film, but then get quickly offed. As with almost every character in this sequel, unlike the original, there's very little time for her to bed in before she's killed, but what a fantastic way to go. And it struck me this time round, watching her desperate entreaties to Richard Thorn in the back of a limo, that all three of these films, to a greater or lesser extent, each feature a dogged journalist trying to get to the truth. The investigations of the Fourth Estate to bring light to the shady, downright evil forces behind the facades of politics and global industry made me wonder whether these, perhaps rather than movies about the devil, were in fact on some level Watergate movies, posing behind all the good old showbiz of a biblical horror movie. I don't think it's too far of a stretch to suggest that Watergate and the assassination of JFK and the subsequent mistrust of bastions of order and law, including the CIA and the FBI, feeds into the feeling in these movies, not just that the rot is spreading through these institutions, but that their very nature provided the ideal breeding ground for such an evil. By the second installment, who are the Thorn family, if not the big screen soap opera-like analogue of the tragedy-laden Kennedy dynasty anyway? Joan's death also brings us to the continuing and fantastic iconography of the Omen franchise. Rottweiler has given way to Crow as the familiar du jour, and I love the mixing it up of evil animal helpers. The stunt crows in this film are great. According to Wikipedia, they were trained by Ray Berwick, who also trained the birds that Hitchcock used in, well, The Birds, and it bloody shows. The shot of the crow starting on the roof of Joan's car and then swooping towards her and attacking her head as she's running away is phenomenal. You bet your ass that if Berwick had been able to train his birds up to that level when Hitch was making his film, he'd have had one of them flying at Tippi Hedren in exactly the same way. And I love how the Rottweiler and the Crow are also represented in the paintings on the phenomenal Giggles wall. Giggles wall is possibly the single greatest addition to Omen mythology in either of the sequel movies. A 13th century monk who was driven insane by visions of the devil paints portraits of the future Antichrist at different stages in his life as a warning to future generations. Now in the film we see the first image concurrent with Damien aged 5 from the first film, and the second shows Damien as he is now with the crow on his finger looking like Jonathan Scott Taylor. Damien as an adult is unseen but points towards the next movie. I like to think that these portraits are moments of flux in the life of the Antichrist, moments in time where it might be possible to prevent the prophecies of his rise to power. And yeah, I get on a meta level they coincide with the movies, but they also coincide with the times when the daggers of Megiddo come into the possession of people who understand what they are and how to use them. And I know that in the movie Giggles wall is said to have depicted 4 faces of the Antichrist. So if you really want to pull that 4th face into canon, you can turn to the books Omen 4 and Omen 5, which explain that 4th face and continue the Omen story with a much greater fidelity to these 3 movies than the appalling Omen 4 The Awakening ever did. I love the film's wintry setting and its cold, austere feel. It brings to mind the frozen lake of ice which makes up Dante's 9th circle of hell. And that is not the only literary allusion in the film. We have another in the form of Damien's acolytes in this movie. There's Paul Buer worming his way to power in Thorn Industries, keeping the seat warm for his future boss, and monetizing famine is such an insidious and downright despicable move that's made all the more horrific because of its bald plausibility. There are horrors in the elaborate deaths and satanic shenanigans, but creeping into Omen II and eventually blossoming in Omen 3 is a kind of more grown-up, chillingly practical horror as seen through the machinations of the Thorn industry. We also have Lance Henriksen as Sergeant Neff overseeing the young Thorn at the military academy. Isn't it weird how they both seem a little like predatory paedophiles circling this young, impressionable target? I do wonder if it would have read that way back in 1978. I'm sure there is a sense, an undercurrent there, which is really uncomfortable because absolutely for sure they are grooming this young boy for a future secret purpose that they have in mind. But I'd never noticed this before until I read it in a review in preparation for this video. Buer and Neff represent 2 of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, famine and war. And I think it's such a shame that that idea wasn't picked up in the final conflict, where we could have been introduced to pestilence and death as well. That would have been amazing. So, as I mentioned at the start of the video, what might have worked better? Because for sure, parts of the plot of Omen II play it a little safe. One of, I think, the very few successful elements in the relatively recent, a few years old Omen TV series, was it called Damien? I think it was called Damien. was the exploration of the notion of different factions within the devil's followers. Like any organized religion, there are disputes about how to interpret prophecies and what the actual role of the Antichrist will be. There's a sense of different camps vying for control of the Antichrist. How I would have loved to have seen Beulah and Neff representing such differing beliefs, a sort of Revelations style blood and thunder view of the Antichrist versus maybe a more CEO, corporate, perhaps almost metaphorical reading of the end times. That would have allowed for more time spent meditating on Damien himself and how he feels about the destiny that people are telling him that he's got. Perhaps it could have even included a member of his family trying to turn Damien towards the light. The character of Mark is placed primarily to be in a position to have been able to do that. So rather than a very similar story of trying to protect or kill Damien, we could have had a film where weirdly different people were fighting for the soul of the Antichrist, if you want to put it that way. A film which could have posed the question, can you rehabilitate the son of the devil? And of course it would have ended with him choosing a path and laying the groundwork for the final conflict, which is a film we will talk about next week.